She slid a yellow legal pad across the kitchen table and told me I owed her rent. Rent. On the house my father built with his own 2 hands, board by board, and left to me in his will. She had it all written out in blue ink, month by month. Going back 2.5 years, $600 a month. For 30 months. $18,000, she said, and she said it kindly. The way you'd remind a child about a library book. Here is what she didn't know. Sitting there in my mother's old chair with her coffee going cold, my name had already been taken off that house. Signed away on a 1-page form, I never touched, on a day. I can prove I was 200 miles away. And here is what she really didn't know. Because nobody in that family ever thought to ask what I was becoming while they were busy telling me what I wasn't. Today, I read property records for a living. I am a licensed title examiner. I find forged deeds before they cost innocent people their homes. And the very first chain of title I ever pulled for myself, the history of one small house on Callaway Street, put my aunt in a courtroom, ended a sale she was desperate to close, and handed an $85,000 debt back to the only person who ever actually signed for it. My name is Mara. I am 30 years old, and I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, in a house that smelled like sawdust and coffee. If you have ever been made to pay for something that was already yours, your home, your time, your own name, then you already know how this story feels from the inside. Stay with me, because this one doesn't end with shouting. It ends with paper. And paper, I learned, is patient. Before we go back, do one thing for me. If somebody in your family ever kept score against you, put the word owed in the comments. Just that. One word. You'll see why it matters by the end. Now let me take you back to where the ledger really started. Not that March morning at the kitchen table. 6 years before that morning, on the day my father's heart stopped in the driveway of the house he built, with a bag of mulch still in his arms. I was 16. My mother had been gone since I was 9, and after her, it had just been the 2 of us, my father and me, in the house on Callaway Street. He was a carpenter, not a contractor with a truck fleet and a slogan, a carpenter. He framed other people's houses for a paycheck, and then he came home and worked on ours for love. He had built it himself over 4 years before I was born. On a lot he bought cheap, because everyone said the grade was wrong. He fixed the grade. He fixed everything. He used to hand me his spirit level. The long brass one with the little glass window and the bubble floating inside, and he'd set it on whatever we'd just built together. A shelf, a step, a birdhouse, and he'd say the same 5 words every time. The bubble doesn't lie. Mara, people lie. He told me once, wood lies. Even your own eyes lie. The bubble doesn't. Remember that phrase. The bubble doesn't lie. It comes back at the end of this story. And when it does, it means something bigger than a shelf. He had a will, a real one, typed, signed, witnessed, sitting in a fireproof box in the hall closet. Because my father was the kind of man who checked things twice. The house went to me. All of it. Held in trust until I turned 18, with his older sister, named as my guardian, Aunt Lorraine. Lorraine arrived 9 days after the funeral with 2 suitcases, a casserole, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She didn't bring a key. She didn't need one. She had something better than a key. She had a plan, and I was too broken to see it, because I was 16. and the only person who had ever been fully on my side was in the ground. I want to be fair to her, because this story is true, and the truth is never a cartoon. Lorraine was not a screamer. She never hit me. She never called me names. In 8 years, I don't think I ever heard her raise her voice. She was calm and organized and endlessly, publicly concerned about me. That was her whole method. Everything she took from me, she took with a folder in her hand and a worried look on her face. And every single thing she did came with the same 6 words attached, spoken warmly, like a blessing. Everything stays in the family. Sweetheart, hold on to those 6 words. 2. She was going to teach me exactly what they meant. And then, years later, in a lawyer's conference room, I was going to teach her. The first thing to go was the workshop. This was about 5 months after the funeral. So, call it 5.5 years before that March morning. With the legal pad, I came home from school on a Friday, and there were folding tables in the driveway. My father's table saw with a price sticker on it, his routers, his hand planes, some of them older than he was, laid out in rows, like they'd been arrested. Lorraine stood in the garage doorway with a cash box and a clipboard. And when she saw my face, she came over and put both hands on my shoulders. The taxes on this place are more than you understand. Honey, she said, tools rust. Money doesn't. Everything stays in the family. I am just turning it into a form we can use. I was 16. I didn't know that the property taxes on Callaway Street were about $1,400 a year, or that my father's life insurance had already paid off the mortgage entirely, or that the trust account she managed had received a settlement check, large enough to carry that house for a decade. I learned all of that much later, from documents, the way I learned everything in this story. That afternoon, I only knew one thing. I went out to the driveway, and while she was making change for a stranger, I slid my father's brass level off the table and walked it up to my room under my jacket. And I hid it in the box spring of my bed like contraband. It was the only thing of his I managed to keep for years. It was the only thing I owned that nobody had a plan for. One more thing happened at that sale, and I didn't understand it for a decade. So file it away the way I did. A heavy-set man in a canvas jacket bought my father's entire rolling toolbox. The big red one, drawers and all. Without opening a single drawer, he paid cash, and he looked at the house for a long moment before he drove off. And something about the way he looked at it wasn't a stranger's look. Remember him. He is carrying a piece of this story in that toolbox. And he keeps it safe for 10 years. School was the second thing. I had a place in a pre-engineering summer program the year I turned 17. My father had filled out half the application with me at the kitchen table the winter before he died. The fee was $900. The trust could have paid it 40 times over. Lorraine sat me down with her worried face and a folder and explained that we had to be careful, that the estate was complicated, that girls with my situation needed practical skills, not expensive hobbies. Her husband Wade needed help in the office of his heating and cooling business that summer. Anyway, answering phones, unpaid of course, because family doesn't invoice. Family, everything stays in the family. Sweetheart. So I spent the summer I was supposed to be building bridges out of balsa wood learning. Instead, how to file invoices, read a work order, and keep a paper trail. I was furious at the time. I want you to notice what I only noticed later. She put me in a chair and made me learn paperwork. Every skill I eventually used to take her apart. I learned in chairs she put me in. There is a word for that, and the word is irony, and it is the only kind of justice this story contains. So we're going to enjoy it slowly. Now, here is the incident that matters most. And I need you to pay close attention to the timing. Because 3 years later, it becomes the hinge of everything. This was 3 years before that March morning. I was 19. I had graduated, and I had gotten myself. No help, 2 buses and a borrowed blazer. An entry-level job offer at a records management company in Richmond, 200 miles away. Orientation was a single Tuesday. I left Roanoke on the first bus at 5:40 a.m. I signed the company's sign-in sheet at 9 a.m. sharp. I sat through 8 hours of training with a visitor badge that had my photograph and the date printed on it. And I kept the folder they gave me. The signed handbook receipt, the badge, the schedule. Because by then keeping papers was simply what I did. I rode home that night feeling, for the first time since the funeral, like a door had opened. I walked in at almost 10 p.m. and Lorraine was at the kitchen table with a manila envelope. And she smiled at me and said the strangest thing. All taken care of. She said, "What is?" I asked. "The tax paperwork on the house." She said, "You'd have found it. Boring. Everything stays in the family." I was 19 and tired and happy. And I said, "Okay." And I went to bed. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because I have replayed that kitchen 1,000 times. The paperwork she was talking about was a quitclaim deed. If you've never heard that term, here is all it is. A quitclaim deed is a 1-page form where an owner hands over their interest in a property. No questions asked, no money required, no proof of anything. It is the fastest, quietest way to move a house from one name to another. And it is a forger's favorite tool for exactly that reason. On that 1 page, recorded at the county courthouse 2 days later, somebody had written my name in a careful, looping signature. My name. Giving the house on Callaway Street. My father's house. My house. To Lorraine. For, and I am quoting the document, $10 and other good and valuable consideration. I did not sign it. I could not have signed it. On the date written on that deed, at the hour a notary swore, I stood in front of her in Roanoke. I was 200 miles away in a training room in Richmond, wearing a visitor badge with my face, and that exact date printed on it. And my signature, my real one, was drawing on a sign-in sheet in somebody else's filing cabinet. She stole my house on the one day of that entire year. I could prove where I was. Almost to the minute. I didn't know any of this yet. I wouldn't know it for 6 more years. But you know it now, and that means, for the rest of this story, you and I get to watch her together, and we get to wait. The Richmond job fell through before it started. The company froze hiring 3 weeks later, and I stayed in Roanoke. And if you've ever had the one door swing shut right after you finally found it, you know the particular gray that settles over the months after. This is the stretch where Lorraine's kindness turned openly into arithmetic. It happened by degrees, the way water cools. First, it was groceries. Just chip in when you can, sweetheart. Then it was my bedroom, which became the guest room, which meant my things migrated to the basement 1 box at a time while I was at work. Always with a reasonable explanation. Wade's sister visits in the spring. You barely used the closet. Then it was utilities. Split 3 ways in a house I owned. And they had moved into. I was cleaning that house, buying 1/3 of its groceries, and handing over slices of my paycheck from the print shop where I worked. And every month, the arrangement grew 1 more small tooth, and through all of it, That yellow legal pad had already been born. I didn't know it yet. She was keeping it in her nightstand, and she had started it. I would eventually learn from the dates in her own handwriting, more than 2 years before she ever showed it to me. Think about that. For 2 years, she smiled at me across that table, called me sweetheart, and every month, in private, in blue ink, she wrote down another $600 I owed her for sleeping in my own house. If you've ever found out that someone was keeping a quiet ledger against you while calling you family, put that word in the comments. Owed, because I read every one of them, and there are more of us than you think. Which brings us to the 0 point of this whole story, the morning. Everything after is measured from a Tuesday in March. I was 22. I remember that morning in minutes. The way you remember a car accident. At 7:10, MI came downstairs in my work shirt. The coffee maker was already going. Lorraine was at the kitchen table in my mother's old chair, and Wade was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Which was unusual, because Wade never attended anything before 9. There was a legal pad on the table, yellow, face down, squared neatly with the table's edge. Sit down for a second. Honey, Lorraine said, we need to talk about the arrangement. I sat. She turned the pad over and slid it across to me. And I looked down at 30 months of my life, converted into a column of blue ink. Each line had a month and a year, and the same number, 600. At the bottom, underlined twice, was the total, $18,000. Now, we're not asking for all of it at once, she said, in the voice you'd use to offer someone a payment plan on their own childhood. But you are 22. Mara, you are an adult living in someone's home. And adults pay rent. It is not personal. It is just what is owed. I want to tell you exactly what I felt, because the feeling is the reason I can still see every object on that table. I did not feel angry. Anger came later and stayed years. What I felt in that moment was the floor moving. The specific vertigo of realizing that a story you have been telling yourself is not the story other people are in. I said, quietly, this is my house. Dad left it to me. And Lorraine did something I will never forget. She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She reached over and patted my hand, twice, and said, sweetheart, numbers, it isn't. Things were handled years ago. Everything stays in the family, and you'll always have a place here, as long as we're square. Then she tapped the total with one finger. Wade looked at the floor. The whole time, he always looked at the floor. Some people commit their sins by looking away from them, and that was Wade's whole contribution to this story. That, and one signature we'll get to later. I didn't yell. I want you to know that. Not because I am proud of it, but because it is the truth, and it set the pattern for everything that came after. I looked at the number for a long moment. Then I stood up, and I said the only sentence I could manage, which was, I need to get to work. And I walked out the kitchen door, except I didn't go to work. I sat in my car in the driveway of my father's house, and I looked at the porch he'd built. And something in me went very quiet and very cold. And the quiet said, you cannot win an argument at that table. They have folders. You have feelings. Stop bringing feelings. I went back inside. At 7:40 a.m., Lorraine was rinsing her mug. I walked past her, up the stairs, and I packed one duffel bag. work clothes, my documents, birth certificate, the Richmond orientation folder I'd kept for 3 years without knowing why. Every pay stub I'd ever been issued, because keeping papers was simply what I did, and last, from inside the box spring, where it had lived for 6 years. My father's brass level. Lorraine watched me come down the stairs with the bag and the level. And for 1 second, I saw something move behind the concern in her face. Not guilt, calculation. "Where are you going?" she said. I said, "I'll let you know when I am square." I had $312 in my checking account. I was 22 years old, and I closed the door of my own house behind me like a guest, and the latch caught with a small sound I can still hear. Stay with me now, because this next part is where the whole story turns, and it turns in the most boring room you can imagine. 6 weeks after that morning, I was sleeping on a coworker's couch and applying to anything with a paycheck when a temp agency sent me to a company called Old Dominion Title, downtown, for a 2-week assignment in something called the file room. If you don't know what a title company does, here it is in one breath. Before anyone buys a house, somebody has to read that house's entire paper history, every deed, every loan, every lien, going back decades, to make sure the seller actually owns what they're selling. That history is called the chain of title. Reading it is a profession. I did not know any of that on my first morning. I just knew the file room was quiet, and the boxes were heavy, and the woman who ran it was named Odessa. Odessa was 61 years old, had been reading chains of title for 35 of them, and had the general bearing of a woman who had never once been surprised by a human being. She watched me work for 2 days, without saying much. On the 3rd day, she put a closed folder in front of me and said, "Tell me what is wrong with this file without opening it." I said, "How would I know without opening it?" She said, "The tab. Somebody typed the wrong year on the tab. Everything in this business is like that, baby. The lie is always small, and it is always on the outside." Then she looked at me for a moment, longer than was comfortable, and asked me, out of nowhere, why a temp girl carries a brass level in her tote bag, and I don't know why. I hadn't told the story to a living soul, but I told her. The house, the will, the legal pad, the $18,000. All of it. Standing in a records room between 2 rolling shelves. Odessa listened the whole way through without once making the sympathetic noise people make. The little wince that tells you they're already composing their advice. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said the sentence I have carried every day since. She said, "Paper is patient, baby. Paper can wait longer than a liar can." And then she went back to her desk, like she hadn't just handed me the rest of my life. I asked her the next day what she meant. She tapped the shelf beside her, 40 years of deed books on microfilm, and said, "Everything anybody ever did to a piece of property in this county is written down somewhere in here, dated and stamped, and it does not care who cries about it. Liars have to keep talking. Mustame, paper, just sits there and waits to be read. Learn to read it, and nobody can ever tell you a story about your own life again." So, I learned to read it. Here is the rebuild, and I am going to give it to you fast, because you already know I survive. The question that matters is what I turned into. The 2-week temp assignment became a permanent file clerk job at $11 an hour. I got a basement studio where the pipes sang in winter, and I hung my father's level on a nail by the door. Dead center, bubble true. the first thing I saw every morning. Within a year, Odessa had pulled me out of the file room and sat me next to her as a trainee abstractor. An abstractor is the person who actually walks the courthouse records and builds the chain of title, deed, by hand. I learned to read a property's whole life in an afternoon. I learned where people hide things. I learned that every divorce, every debt, every desperate season of a family's life leaves a paper shadow at the courthouse. And I learned the special quiet that comes over you when documents start disagreeing with each other. 2 years after that, March morning, I was doing full abstracts on my own. 4 years after it, I passed the state licensing exam and became a title examiner, the person who takes the abstract and renders the verdict. Clean or clouded, safe or not, my signature started going on. Title commitments. Banks lent money because my name said the paper was true. Sit. With that, 1 second, the girl whose name had been forged onto a deed grew up to be the person whose name decides whether deeds can be trusted. Nobody planned that. Or maybe I did, one filing box at a time, without ever letting myself say it out loud. Because here is the thing I have to admit to you. And if you've ever circled a wound for years without touching it, you'll understand. In all that time, 5 years after that March morning, I had never once pulled the records on Calloway Street. Land records are public. Anyone can walk in off the street and read the history of any house. In the county, I had spent years, professionally, an 8-minute walk from the room that held the truth about my own home. And I had never gone to look. Odessa noticed. Of course, Odessa noticed everything. She never pushed. She only said once, over coffee, "When you are ready, baby, the paper will still be there." That is the whole point of paper. What finally made me ready was small and stupid. The way real turning points are. 5 years after that March morning, on an ordinary Thursday, a coworker mentioned a new listing she'd driven past. Cute little craftsman on Calloway. Sellers asking $280. And the room went far away. Lorraine was selling my father's house, asking $280,000 for the porch he built. The grade he fixed, the walls that still had, I was sure of it, his pencil marks inside them. I sat at my desk for 10 more minutes. Very still. Then I stood up, told Odessa I was taking a long lunch, and walked 8 minutes to the courthouse. I want to take you into that records room, because what happened in there is the reveal this whole story has been walking toward. And I am going to show it to you the way it came to me. 1 page at a time. The chain of title for Calloway Street was short. My father bought the lot the year before I was born. That deed was page 1, and seeing his signature. The real one, small and square, no flourish. A carpenter's signature. Put a pressure behind my eyes that I breathed through, because I was not going to be a woman crying in the records room. Page 2 was the release of the mortgage, paid in full by his life insurance, 4 months after he died. Exactly as I'd suspected. The house had been free and clear the entire time. Lorraine was crying poor about taxes. Every folding table in that driveway. Every handplane sold to strangers. Every summer program I didn't attend. None of it had ever been necessary. That was page 2. Page 3 was the quitclaim deed. 1 page, like they always are. Dated 3 years before that March morning. My name, printed. My name, signed. In a looping, confident hand that was not mine. Has never been mine. I sign like my father, small and square, conveying the property at Calloway Street to Lorraine. For $10, and other good and valuable consideration. And at the bottom, a notary block. A notary, if you've never dealt with one, is a licensed witness whose stamped seal legally swears that the signer stood in front of them, in person, and proved their identity. The stamp on my forged deed swore exactly that. It swore that on that date, at that place. I personally appeared. I stood in the records room and I read the date twice, and then I laughed. One short breath of a laugh. The kind that isn't about anything funny. Because I knew that date the way you know your own birthday. It was the Richmond orientation. The sign in sheet. The visitor badge with my photograph. And that date printed under my chin, sitting at that very moment, in a folder in my apartment, 3 years of dust on it. Kept for no reason except that keeping papers was simply what I did. She had picked the one day I could prove. Out of 365 days, her forger had picked the one with my alibi, already laminated. Call the quitclaim by its nickname from here on. The one page. Because that is what it was, one page against my whole life. And then, because I am a title examiner and we always read one entry further, I read one entry further, same chain. Next instrument, 2 years after the one page. So, 1 year before, that March morning at the kitchen table. Lorraine had borrowed against the house, a home equity line, which is exactly what it sounds like. A loan where the house itself is the collateral, where the bank safety is the deed, $85,000. Secured by my father's house, signed by Lorraine, and co-signed by Wade. There is his one signature, the man who studied the floor, $85,000. IP. That is not a number, so let me make it one you can feel. That is more than my father earned in 2 full years of framing other people's houses. That is every mortgage payment he ever made, borrowed back out of his walls by the woman who sold his tools for taxes. He didn't owe. And here is the detail that reorganized my entire understanding of that March morning. The detail I need you to hold. The loan was taken 1 year before the legal pad, which means that when Lorraine slid $18,000 of rent across that table, patting my hand, telling me adults pay what is owed, she was already $85,000 deep into a house she had stolen with a forged page. And the ledger wasn't discipline. The ledger was cash flow. I wasn't a niece who needed a lesson. I was a revenue line. I made copies of everything, paid the clerk in exact change, walked to my car in the courthouse garage, closed the door, and cried, once. Oh, alone. 8 minutes, maybe 10. Forehead on the wheel, for the 16-year-old at the folding tables, for the pencil marks inside those walls, for my father's small square signature on page 1. Then I wiped my face, and I drove back to the office. And I never cried about any of it again. That is not toughness. That is just what happens when grief finally gets a job to do. Now, pause with me for one breath. Because this is the exact middle of the story. And it is the moment where most people in my position make the mistake that loses everything. If this were a movie, this is where I drive to the house and confront her on the lawn with the copies in my fist. I want you to understand why I didn't. Because it is the whole difference between a scene and a verdict. Confrontation warns them. Documents don't care about warnings, but people who forge documents get very busy the moment they know you are coming. Stories get coordinated. Papers get lost. Memories get soft. Odessa had spent 5 years teaching me the other way. Paper is patient, so I decided I would not say one single word to Lorraine until every word I said was already true in a courthouse. If you are watching this, and you are sitting on your own version of the one page, subscribe and stay with me through this next part, because the next 10 minutes are the closest thing I can give you to a map. Here is exactly what I did, in order, and notice, please, that every single step is boring, legal, and open to absolutely anyone. That is the point. That was always going to be the point. First, I hired a lawyer, not a shark. A calm, gray-haired real estate attorney who listened to the whole story, looked at my copies for a long time, and then said the most beautiful sentence anyone had said to me in years. This is not a family dispute, Miss Ellison. This is a defective chain of title. And defects don't heal. Notice what he did there. He took the thing that had been a wound my entire adult life and reclassified it as paperwork. I could have hugged him. Second, we verified the stamp, the notary on the one page, the licensed witness, whose seal swore I stood in that room, turned out to be a woman who did occasional paperwork for Wade's heating and cooling business. Notary commissions are public records, too. The state keeps a list of who is licensed and until when. We ordered her record. Her commission had expired 14 months before the date on my deed. 14 months. Tune fort. The stamp she pressed onto the one page was legally dead. The day she used it, a prop, a rubber lie, my lawyer started calling it the dead stamp, and the name stuck. So that is evidence item 2, the one page, and the dead stamp. Third, the Tuesday folder, my Richmond orientation file, the sign-in sheet copy, the schedule, and the visitor badge, with my photograph and the date, the same date as the deed, printed right under my chin. My lawyer held that badge for a moment and actually smiled, which I suspect real estate attorneys are trained never to do. He said, "In 30 years, I have never had an alibi with lamination." We backed it up properly. The Richmond company still existed, and their records department confirmed my attendance in writing. Signed and notarized by a notary whose stamp, I am pleased to report, was thoroughly alive. And fourth, this one rides along with the one page, same chain. One entry further, the $85,000 loan, because the moment the deed fails, that loan is a bomb sitting in Lorraine's lap. And everyone at that bank was about to learn it at the same time she did. Then we filed 2 documents, 1 week, and I want you to understand what they were, because they're the quiet machinery of everything that follows. The first was a lawsuit called a quiet title action. Despite the gentle name, it is a demand that a judge examine the chain and declare, once and for all, who actually owns a property. The second, filed the same afternoon at the courthouse, was a notice called a lease pendens. Plain words. It is a public flag pinned to the property's record that tells the entire world. Every buyer, every bank, every title examiner like me, that ownership of this house is in dispute. Do not touch it until a court says otherwise. It costs a few dollars to file. It cannot be argued with, hidden, or charmed away. And from the second, it was stamped. Lorraine's sale was already dead. She just didn't know it yet. Because the beautiful, terrible thing about a lis pendens is that nobody calls you about it. You find out when the system finds it. And I knew, because this is my profession, because I sit on the other side of this exact moment every week of my life. Precisely when and how the system would find it. Some examiner across town, a stranger to all of us, would pull the chain on Callaway Street for the buyer's title company, read down the entries the same way I had, reach my flag, and stop. No drama. No confrontation. Just a person like me, doing their job correctly. 3 days before closing. One more thing, so nobody watching thinks I bent my own profession to do this. I never touched Calloway Street at work. Not the file, not the plant records, nothing. I was a party to the dispute, and examiners don't examine their own cases. That is the brightest line we have. I didn't need to. That is what I'd finally understood in the records room. I didn't need to be the examiner on that file. I just needed to be right in the public record, and any examiner alive would do the rest. The system I'd spent 5 years learning to serve was always going to be the thing that served me. Not because I rigged it, but because for the first time in my life, the truth and the paperwork agreed. The call Lorraine got 3 days before her closing. I only know about secondhand from what came after. The buyer's title company found the flag exactly on schedule. The commitment was pulled. The buyer, who had children enrolled in schools and a moving truck reserved, walked away that same afternoon and got every dollar of the deposit back. Which is what happens when a title fails. The innocent people, the listing agent, I am told, quit the listing by email, and an $85,000 loan, secured by a house Lorraine, suddenly could not sell. Sat there in the dark, accruing interest. Waiting for the second phase of this to begin, my phone rang at 6:15. That evening, her name on the screen for the first time in 5 years. I let it ring out. She called 4 more times. Before 8 p.m. Then came the text, and I want to read it to you word for word, because it is a perfect document. And by now you and I both know how to read documents. It said, Mara, something has gone very wrong with the house, and I think there has been some kind of clerical mistake with your name on some old papers. Call me tonight. Family handles things privately. Read it again. Some kind of clerical mistake. Your name on some old papers. 5 years of silence. And her opening move was to hand me the cover story she expected me to help her tell. I did not call her that night. I texted back one sentence. The first words I had spoken to her since the driveway. And then I turned off my phone. I wrote, all communication goes through my attorney, whose information you will receive tomorrow. Everything else stays in the courthouse. She asked for a meeting. Of course, through her own lawyer, 3 weeks later, a settlement conference, they called it, which is the legal system's phrase for let's all sit in a room and see who blinks. My attorney asked if I wanted to attend or let him handle it. I thought about it for exactly one night, with the level on its nail by the door. And I said I'd come, not to argue. I had no intention of arguing. Then or ever, I came to do the one thing she had never once done to me across any table in my life. I came to inform her, plainly, of what was already true. A Tuesday, 10 a.m., a conference room with a long table and bad coffee. She wore the worried face. It landed on me the way rain lands on a roof. Wade studied the table's grain, like it owed him money. Her lawyer opened with a speech about family and misunderstandings and how litigation only enriches the attorneys. His own invoice presumably notwithstanding, and offered, generously, to let me have some equity from the eventual sale if I would withdraw my flag, and let the closing be rescheduled. Some equity from the sale of my father's house. When he finished, my attorney looked at me, and I put a folder on the table. I have never in my life enjoyed an object more. And I said, I'll be brief. There are 3 things, and I am going to number them. Because numbers were always this family's love language. 1. The deed you rely on is a forgery, and I don't have to argue that. Because on the date your notary swore I stood in a room in Roanoke, I was 200 miles away. On camera, on a sign-in sheet, wearing a badge with that date printed under my photograph. The badge is in this folder. It has been in a folder for 8 years. You taught me that. Lorraine, you taught me that whoever keeps the papers ends the argument. 2. The stamp on that deed expired 14 months before it was used. The state's own records say so, and the state has been formally notified. And what the state does with its notaries is out of everyone's hands at this table, including mine. 3. When the deed fails, and it will fail, your $85,000 loan stops being attached to my house and starts being attached to you, both of you. There is a second signature on it. So, here is the entirety of my offer. Nothing. I am not asking for anything, because none of this is a request. I am not angry anymore. And I need you to understand that is the worst news you've gotten all year. Angry people settle. I am just correct, and I have time. You told me once that everything stays in the family. You were right. The house stays with me. The debt stays with you. Everything. Finally, exactly where it belongs. Then I stood, thanked the room, and left, and I was in the elevator before my heart remembered to beat fast. Which is apparently how my body does courage. Invoice afterward. Her lawyer called my lawyer before I reached the parking garage. The tone, I am told, had changed considerably. I wish I could tell you, she went quietly. She did not. And honestly, this next part is for everyone in the comments who has been waiting to feel something land. So, let's not rush it. Over the following 4 months, while the case moved, Lorraine escalated in exactly the order I would have predicted if you'd shown me her file cold. First came the voicemails, 11 of them. I kept everyone, obviously, which traveled, message by message, through the entire catalog. Warm, then wounded, then furious. Then warm again, like a thermostat with a broken sensor. In one, she cried. In the next, she called me an ungrateful little clerk, which I'll admit I've considered putting on a mug. Then Wade appeared in the lobby of Old Dominion Title one Thursday, holding his cap, asking the receptionist if he could just talk to me for a minute. Family thing. I did not. Come down. Our office manager, a woman with the warmth of a filing cabinet, and my eternal loyalty, informed him that solicitation of staff regarding personal litigation was not permitted on the premises, and Wade, floor studier to the last, apologized to the carpet and left. And finally came the email, the long one. If you've ever received the long email, you know it by weight before you've read a word. 1,400 words. Whiten, a guided tour of her sacrifices. The casseroles, the guardianship, the burden of the taxes. The years she gave up. The sister duty she never asked for. 1,400 words, and I searched it twice, with the find function, like the professional I am. The word, sorry, appears 0 times. The word forged appears 0 times. My father appears once. As context for the house, I replied with one line. The last private words I have ever sent her. You kept a ledger. So did Aysen. Mine had receipts. The case never even reached a trial. Her lawyer was good enough to know what a laminated alibi does to a jury, and the notary, facing the state's questions about the dead stamp, declined, through counsel, to defend the acknowledgement at all, which in plain words means the licensed witness refused to swear twice to the lie she'd stamped. Once, 14 months after I filed, a judge signed a final order. And I want to read you the operative sentence, because I have it framed, and because the flattest language I have ever encountered is also the most beautiful. The purported quitclaim deed is declared void ab initio, void from the beginning, as if it never existed. And fee simple title to the property is quieted in Mara Ellison, void from the beginning. 8 years of my life, corrected in 5 syllables of lawyer Latin. The one page died in a single sentence, the way it was born in one, and then the consequences arrived, one envelope at a time, and none of them came from me. Which is my favorite part. The bank's lawyers, discovering their $85,000, was secured by a deed that legally never existed. Did what banks do. They went after the signatures, both of them. A judgment against Lorraine and Wade personally. Their names published in the legal notices. The little gray columns Lorraine used to read at the kitchen table to cluck at other families' failures. The state revoked what remained of the notary's standing and put its finding in writing. Improper notarial act. Commission expired at time of acknowledgement. One sentence of bureaucratic concrete, and referred the file onward, and where it went from there is the state's business and not my story to tell. Wade's heating and cooling business, which had been quietly bleeding for years. The reason, I eventually understood. For the loan, the ledger, all of it surrendered its lease that spring. They moved to a rental across town. I know this only because the county mailed me, at my new address, the redirected property tax bill for Callaway Street, with my name on it, spelled correctly, owing $1,412. I have never paid a bill faster, or with more pleasure in my life. $1,400. I wages, the number she once used to sell his tools. It turned out to be the actual size of the burden all along. One decent paycheck, once a year. She built 8 years of theater on a bill, smaller than her television. So here is the ending. And I promised you at the start it wouldn't be a movie ending, and I keep my promises the way I keep my papers. I did not get my family back. However, let me say that plainly, because videos like this one love to end on a tearful driveway reconciliation, and I owe you the truth instead. There was no apology. Ever. There is, to this day. No relationship. A cousin reached out once, carefully, to say she'd always thought something was off in that house, and we have coffee twice a year now, and that is it. That is the entire salvage from the wreck of a family. 2 coffees a year with a woman brave enough to say the quiet thing 5 years too late. I decided that is worth keeping anyway. You take the true things, whatever size they come in. What I got back instead was the house. I moved in on a Saturday in October, 6.5 years after that March morning, with a duffel bag and a level, which is to say, with exactly what I left with. The house was tired. She'd let it go the way people let go of things they never really believed were theirs. But tired is fixable. Tired is what I do. I spent that first day just walking it. And in the hallway upstairs, where the afternoon light comes in low, I found what I had been half looking for since I was 16. Pencil marks inside the closet frame, my father's handwriting, faded, but there, heights and dates climbing the wood. My heights, my dates measured every birthday until I was 9, until my mother died. And I suppose The measuring stopped. Nobody had ever painted over them. Even she hadn't seen them. Some records survive by being too small to steal. And then, 2 weeks later, the doorbell rang. And this is the part I still can't tell out loud without stopping once in the middle. A heavy-set man in a canvas jacket stood on my porch. Grayer, slower, but I knew him the second I saw him. Because I had been keeping him in a folder in my memory for 10 years. The man from the folding tables. The man who bought my father's entire rolling toolbox without opening a drawer. His name is Ray, and he framed houses beside my father for 11 years. And he'd seen the sale come and go in the legal notices. And he'd seen my name. And he'd waited until the dust settled the way careful men do. "These are your dad's," he said, and behind him on the walk was the big red toolbox. Every drawer intact. "I bought them that day, so they'd stay together," he said. "Figured someday somebody would come looking. Took you long enough." Kid, he wouldn't take $1. He took a cup of coffee, standing in the kitchen, telling me stories about my father I'd never heard. And then, as he was leaving, he stopped and said, "Check the bottom drawer, under the liner. There is something of his that isn't a tool, under the liner." In the bottom drawer was a notebook, a carpenter's job notebook, graph paper, coffee ring on the cover, and inside, in my father's small square handwriting, was the build. This house. 4 years of it, logged like the professional he was, dates, materials, hours. Every entry checked off twice, because he checked everything twice. And at the top of the first page, before any of it, he had written the name of the job, the way he wrote the name of every job. And the name of this job was 2 words, Mara's house. Not the family house. Not our house. Mara's house. Written the year before I was born, by a man logging thousands of unpaid hours toward a person he hadn't met yet. I sat down on the kitchen floor with that notebook and I read every page. And I did not cry, because I had already spent my one allotment in a parking garage years before. But I'll tell you what I did do. I laughed, because I finally understood what I was holding, and what this whole story had actually been about. From the very first minute, Lorraine kept a ledger of everything I owed. It turned out somebody had been keeping the other ledger all along. Every hour, every board, every debt, running the opposite direction. A complete, dated, itemized record of what was owed to me. She hid hers in a nightstand. His waited 10 years in the bottom of a toolbox. Under the liner, patient as paper. The level lives on the porch rail, now. On the evening I finished reading the notebook, I carried it out there and set it down on the rail my father built. The rail she never repaired. The rail I will fix next spring with his tools. And I watched the bubble drift. And settle, and center, dead level. After everything, 20-some years of weather, 6 years of her, 14 months of lawyers, and the line he built still ran true, and the little bubble sat in the middle of its window, like it had simply been waiting for someone to come back and read it. The bubble doesn't lie. People lie. Ledgers lie. If the wrong hands keep them, deeds lie. 1 page at a time, with dead stamps pressed on top. But somewhere under every lie there is a true line that somebody honest built first, and it holds. And if you are patient, if you are paper patient, you will live to set your level on it and watch it prove itself. So that is my story. She said everything stays in the family, and in the end she was right in the only way that ever mattered. My father's house stayed with my father's daughter. If this story pressed on something in your own life, If somebody ever handed you a ledger for what was already yours, put the word level in the comments so I know you made it to the end. And subscribe if you want more stories where the quiet ones keep the receipts. Tell me where you are watching from. I read every comment, usually in the evening on the porch, next to a brass level that has never once lied to me. Take care of your papers. Take care of yourselves. And remember, paper is patient. Be patient, like paper.